You can tell who someone really is by how they behave when everything falls apart. The police lights painted the windows in soft flashes of red and blue, reflecting off the polished glass like a memory that refused to settle. And in the middle of it all, a man in handcuffs turned his head, not toward the officers, not toward the crowd, but toward her, his voice low, almost confused. "You knew, didn't you?" And she didn't answer. She just stood there with the same quiet expression, the same stillness that had been there long before anyone else realized something was wrong. Because 10 minutes earlier, before the tension, before the noise, before the moment that would change how one man saw the world, the restaurant had been exactly what it was meant to be: warm lighting, soft jazz drifting through the air, the low hum of conversations between people who never had to think about the cost of anything on the menu. Daniel Whitmore sat near the center of the room, a tailored navy suit, a watch that caught the light just enough to remind people who he was without him saying a word, his pen moving across a contract worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Control was his language, precision his comfort, and everything about the evening followed that rhythm, until it didn't. But before that shift, before the invisible line was crossed, there was Emily Carter, moving between tables with quiet efficiency, her black uniform simple, unremarkable, almost designed to disappear. Except she didn't disappear, not completely, not to someone like Daniel, who noticed patterns for a living. She didn't rush, didn't linger, every movement measured, every glance intentional. She set down a glass of water at exactly the right angle, adjusted a chair without making a sound, and when she passed the entrance, her eyes flicked to the door for half a second longer than necessary, then to the windows, then to the people seated nearest the exits. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it wasn't random. Daniel noticed because noticing was what made him who he was. He paused mid-signature, watching her as she moved back toward the kitchen. There was no fear in her, no distraction, just awareness, the kind that didn't belong to someone doing a routine shift. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, just a shift. In the air, the front door opening a little too fast, a presence that didn't match the rhythm of the room. Conversations hesitated, forks paused midair, something unspoken moved through the space. And while others turned in confusion, Emily had already seen it, her body still, her breathing unchanged, as if this moment had already played out somewhere in her mind before it ever reached reality. Daniel felt it then, that unfamiliar sensation, the one he couldn't quantify or control, and for the first time that night, he wasn't watching the deal in front of him, he was watching her, because in a room where everything was about to unravel, Emily Carter was the only person who looked like she already understood how it would end. The sound did not arrive all at once. It crept in, subtle, like a crack forming beneath polished glass, a chair scraping a fraction too sharply, a voice at the entrance that did not match the softness of the room. And then the silence that followed was louder than anything that came before it. Conversations faded not because anyone told them to stop, but because something deeper in the room understood that this moment required attention. Daniel felt it in the way his pen paused above the paper, in the way his chest tightened without reason he could explain, and when he looked up again, the man near the door stood out not for what he did, but for what he carried in his posture. Tension, urgency, something unfinished, not the calculated confidence Daniel was used to seeing in boardrooms, but something raw, something unstable, and around him, people reacted the only way they knew how, confusion first, then unease, eyes searching for cues, for leadership, for someone to tell them how to respond, but no one did, not immediately, because fear does not always shout, sometimes it waits, and in that waiting, it grows, except in one place, except in one person. Emily did not move the way the others did. She did not freeze in uncertainty or rush in panic. She simply adjusted, her hand setting down a tray without a sound, her shoulders relaxing instead of tightening, as if she had stepped into a role she recognized, not one she feared, her eyes steady, not on the man directly but on everything around him, the distance between tables, the position of the exits, the people closest to him. She was not focused on the center of the problem, she was mapping the edges of it, and Daniel saw it clearly now. This was not instinct alone, this was understanding. The kind that comes from experience no one talks about. The kind that changes how you see a room forever. Someone at a nearby table stood too quickly. their chair tipping slightly, the sound breaking whatever fragile calm remained. A ripple of movement followed, people shifting, whispering. The beginning of disorder, but Emily's voice cut through it. Not loud, not commanding, just present. It is okay, please stay seated. Simple words, evenly spoken, but they carried something stronger than volume. They carried certainty, and that certainty spread faster than fear, not to everyone, not completely, but enough to slow the unraveling. Daniel watched as the man at the entrance hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between him and the room. And Emily saw it too. Of course she did. Her gaze softened, not with sympathy, but with recognition, as if she understood the weight he carried without needing to ask. She took a single step forward, not enough to challenge, not enough to provoke, just enough to be seen. And in that moment, Daniel realized something that unsettled him more than anything else that night. She was not reacting. She was choosing, every movement, every word, deliberate, controlled, and for a man who built his life on control, who measured risk in numbers and outcomes, there was something profoundly unsettling about watching someone control a situation without power, without authority, without anything except presence. The room held its breath, waiting for something to break, but Emily did not let it. She stood there, calm in a way that did not deny fear, but understood it. And Daniel knew, without knowing how he knew, that whatever happened next would not be decided by force. It would be decided by her. The hesitation did not last long, but it was enough for Emily to see what others missed. The way his shoulders rose and fell too quickly, the way his eyes moved not with intent, but with uncertainty, searching, calculating, retreating all at once. This was not someone in control. This was someone overwhelmed by a moment that had grown larger than he expected, and Emily understood something then that shaped everything that followed. This was not about stopping him. This was about reaching him. She took another step, slow, measured, her shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor, and Daniel felt the shift immediately, not in the room, but in himself, because every instinct he had built over decades told him this was wrong, that you do not move closer to uncertainty, you create distance. You protect, you contain, but Emily did the opposite, and somehow, it worked. Hey, she said, her voice soft but clear, not directed at the room, not meant for anyone else, just him. One word, simple, human, and it landed differently than any command ever could. The man's gaze flickered toward her, just for a second, but it was enough. Connection, fragile but real. Emily did not rush to fill the silence. She let it breathe, let him process, let him feel seen instead of cornered, and Daniel realized that this was not bravery in the way he understood. It was something else entirely, something quieter, something deeper. Emily's eyes moved briefly to the man's hands, then to his jacket, then back to his face, small details, the kind most people ignored. But to her they were pieces of a story, and she was reading it in real time. You are not here to hurt anyone, she said, not as a question, not as a guess, but as a statement, calm, grounded, and the effect was immediate. The tension in the man's posture shifted, not gone, but softened, like a knot beginning to loosen. People in the room exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what they were witnessing, unsure if they should feel safer or more afraid. But Daniel felt something else entirely, recognition, not of the situation, but of the method. This was negotiation, not the kind done in glass offices with contracts and leverage, but something far more raw, far more precise. Emily was not offering solutions. She was offering understanding, and in that understanding, she was changing the direction of the moment. She took another step, closing the distance just enough to matter, her voice steady. Something brought you here, right? Something that felt like there was no other way. And for the first time, the man responded, not with words, but with stillness, the kind that signals listening, real listening. Emily nodded slightly, as if confirming something only she could see, and Daniel leaned forward in his chair without realizing it, drawn in, because what was happening defied everything he believed about power. There was no authority here, no control in the traditional sense, and yet the entire room was shifting around her. It does not have to end badly, she continued, her tone unchanged, no urgency, no pressure, just possibility. And that was when Daniel understood the real difference. She was not trying to win. She was trying to guide. And somehow, that made her the most powerful person in the room. The silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy. It was focused, waiting, and in that space, something invisible began to change, something no one could force, something that could only happen when one person chose to see another not as a threat, but as a human being standing at the edge of a decision. The man's breathing slowed, not because the situation had changed, but because something inside him had, and Emily saw it the way a musician hears a note shift in a melody, subtle, but undeniable. She did not move closer this time. She held her ground, giving him space, because space was what he needed more than anything else, not pressure, not commands, just a moment to think without feeling trapped. Her eyes dropped briefly to the object in his hand, then back to his face, never lingering, never challenging, just acknowledging. And in that quiet acknowledgement, she removed the invisible line that separated him from everyone else in the room. He was no longer an outsider, no longer a disruption. He was simply a person standing in the middle of a decision. "You are tired," she said gently, and it was not an assumption. It was an observation, one that landed deeper than anything louder ever could. His shoulders lowered just slightly, enough for Emily to know she was right, enough for Daniel to realize this was not guesswork. This was precision of a different kind, not numbers, not data, but human truth, the kind that could not be calculated but could be felt. The man swallowed, his eyes flickering again, not toward the exits this time, but toward the floor, toward something internal, something heavy, and Emily nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if encouraging him without pushing him. "Whatever happened before you walked in here?" She continued, her voice steady. "It does not have to decide what happens next." The words settled into the room, not as a solution, but as an option, and options were powerful. Daniel knew that better than anyone, but he had never seen them offered like this, without leverage, without demand, just placed gently in front of someone and left for them to choose. A glass somewhere in the room shifted as someone adjusted their grip, the faint sound breaking the stillness for a fraction of a second. But no one spoke, no one moved beyond what was necessary, because all attention had narrowed to this moment, to this exchange that felt both fragile and unbreakable at the same time. Emily took a slow breath, visible enough to be noticed, subtle enough to be shared, and something remarkable happened. The man mirrored it, unconsciously, his breathing aligning with hers, steadier now, less erratic, and in that synchronization, control began to return, not imposed from the outside, but rebuilt from within. Daniel felt it like a shift in gravity. The room no longer pulled in every direction. It centered, around her, around the quiet authority she carried without ever claiming it. "You do not need to prove anything right now," Emily said, her tone softening just slightly. "You just need to make one good choice." And there it was, not a demand, not an ultimatum, just a single step, manageable, possible. The man's gaze lifted again, meeting hers fully for the first time, and Daniel saw it clearly, the conflict, the hesitation, the weight of everything that had led to this point, but also something new, something fragile, hope, not loud, not certain, but present. And Emily did not rush to fill the space that followed. She let it exist, because she understood something that Daniel was only beginning to grasp, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to act, not to speak, but to give someone the room to choose who they are going to be next. And in that silence, with nothing forcing him, nothing pushing him, the man's grip loosened, just slightly, almost unnoticeable, but enough to change everything. The shift was small, almost invisible, but Emily did not miss it. She never missed the small things, because the small things were where truth lived, the slight loosening of his grip, the way his shoulders dropped just a fraction, the way his eyes no longer darted around the room but stayed, focused, present. And she knew that this was the moment, not the end, not the resolution, but the turning point where everything could still go either way, and what happened next would depend not on force, not on fear, but on whether he felt understood enough to let go. She did not move closer. She did not raise her voice. She simply stayed exactly where she was, grounded, steady, giving him something no one else in the room could offer, stability. "You have been carrying this for a while," she said softly, her words slow, deliberate, as if each one was placed with care, and the man's expression shifted again, not dramatically, not in a way that others might notice, but enough for Emily to see the weight behind it, the exhaustion. The kind that does not come from a single bad day, but from too many difficult ones stacked together. Daniel watched, his hands resting on the table now. Forgotten, because whatever deal had occupied his attention minutes ago no longer mattered. This was something else entirely, something he could not quantify, and yet he could not look away. You thought this was the only option, Emily continued, her tone unchanged, not accusing, not judging, just stating what she saw. And for the first time, the man nodded, barely, but it was there, a silent admission that carried more weight than words ever could. A ripple moved through the room, subtle, cautious, people beginning to understand that something was changing, that the edge they had been standing on was no longer as sharp. Emily let a breath pass, slow and visible, and again, he followed, his breathing syncing with hers, steadier now, more controlled, as if he was borrowing her calm until he could find his own. But you are still here, she said, and there was something different in her voice now, something warmer, not softer, but more human, more connected, which means you have not given up yet. The words settled into him, into the space between them, and Daniel felt it too, the shift from tension to something else, something fragile but growing, possibility. Emily's gaze held his, unwavering, not challenging, not demanding, just present, and in that presence, she gave him something rare, the feeling that he was not alone in the moment. Even though everyone else kept their distance, a faint sound came from outside, distant, approaching, but Emily did not react to it. She stayed focused, because she understood that what mattered was happening here, in this quiet exchange, not in anything beyond it. You do not need to solve everything tonight, she said gently. Just this moment, simple, manageable, one step instead of 1,000. And Daniel realized that was the brilliance of it. She was not asking him to become someone else. She was asking him to choose one better action. Right now, nothing more, nothing less. The man's eyes dropped to his hands again. And this time, when he looked back up, there was something different there. Not fear, not panic, but clarity, and slowly, carefully, as if testing the weight of his own decision, he began to lower what he was holding. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to show that he was choosing something else, something better, and Emily did not react, did not celebrate, did not move. She simply stayed calm, because she knew that true change does not need an audience. It just needs space to happen, and in that space, in that quiet, fragile moment, the entire room shifted, not because someone forced it, but because one person was finally ready to let go. The moment did not explode into relief the way people expected. It unfolded quietly, almost gently, like a storm choosing to pass instead of strike. The object in the man's hand lowered another inch, then another, until it was no longer the center of the room, no longer the thing everyone's eyes were drawn to. And in its place, there was something else, something far more powerful, his decision. Emily watched without moving, without breaking the fragile balance they had created together, because she understood that this was not the time to step in. This was the time to let him step back on his own. And he did, slowly, carefully, as if relearning how to exist in a world that was no longer closing in on him. A breath left his chest, heavier than the ones before, and for the first time since he had entered, his shoulders dropped completely, not in defeat, but in release. Daniel felt it like a shift in pressure. The room expanding again, air returning, sound creeping back in at the edges, someone quietly exhaling, a glass being set down with trembling fingers, the soft hum of life resuming. But no one dared to speak. Not yet, because what had just happened demanded a kind of respect that words could not hold. Emily finally took a small step forward, not toward control, but toward closure, her voice as steady as it had been from the beginning. That is it, she said softly, not praising, not commanding, just acknowledging. And the man looked at her. Really looked this time, not with fear, not with urgency, but with something else, something closer to understanding, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a stranger, not as an obstacle, but as someone who had given him a way out when he could not find one himself. Distant sounds grew louder now, measured, organized, approaching from outside. But even then, Emily did not rush. She did not hand the moment over. She stayed present until the very end, until the man took a small step back, then another, creating space where there had been none. And in that space, everything changed. Daniel stood slowly, not because he needed to, but because he could not remain seated in the presence of what he had just witnessed. This was not power as he knew it. It was not influence, not authority, not wealth. It was something quieter, something that did not announce itself but revealed itself in moments like this. And it unsettled him in a way he could not ignore. Emily bent slightly, picking up a fallen napkin from the floor as if returning the room to its original state was just another part of her shift, just another task to complete. And that was when Daniel realized the most astonishing part of all. She was not changed by this moment. Not outwardly, not in the way others would be. She did not seek recognition, did not look around for approval. She simply returned to stillness, to presence, to the quiet rhythm she had carried from the very beginning. And as the situation resolved itself fully, as order replaced uncertainty, Daniel remained standing, watching her, because in a world where everything he understood was built on control, he had just seen something far greater, someone who never needed to take control at all, because she knew how to guide it instead. The room did not return to normal all at once. It rebuilt itself in layers. First the silence softened, then the tension thinned, then the quiet sounds of movement began to reappear, a chair sliding gently back into place, a glass lifted with careful hands, a breath released that had been held for far too long. And through it all, Emily moved as she always had, unhurried, precise, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if guiding a moment like that was simply part of the work. Daniel remained where he stood, watching her with a focus that felt different now, no longer analytical, no longer detached, but searching, because what he had just witnessed did not fit into any framework he understood. He had built companies, led negotiations, navigated crises that involved millions of dollars and hundreds of employees. But this was something else entirely. This was influence without authority, control without force, and he could not ignore it. The officers moved in with calm efficiency, their presence firm but measured, and the man who had stood at the center of everything moments ago no longer resisted, no longer struggled against the situation. He followed their guidance with quiet compliance, his gaze drifting once more toward Emily, and there was something unspoken in that look, something that did not need words, gratitude, perhaps, or recognition, or simply the acknowledgement that she had seen him when he needed it most. And Emily met that look with the same calm expression, not claiming credit, not holding on to the moment, just accepting it for what it was, a human exchange that had reached its natural end. Daniel exhaled slowly, only now realizing how tightly he had been holding himself together, his mind attempting to process what logic could not fully explain. He stepped forward, almost without thinking, his polished shoes echoing softly against the floor. And for a brief second, he hesitated, a rare occurrence for a man who made decisions in seconds. But this was different. This was not a business move, not a calculated step. This was something personal, something unfamiliar. Emily, he said, her name feeling unusual on his tongue, not because it was difficult, but because he had never needed to remember the name of someone in her position before, and that realization alone unsettled him more than he expected. She turned toward him, her expression unchanged, attentive but neutral, as if he was just another part of the room returning to its place. "How did you know?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying the weight of everything he could not articulate. Emily studied him for a moment, not evaluating, not judging, just seeing, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I did not know," she said quietly, and that answer should have frustrated him, should have left him unsatisfied, but it did the opposite. It forced him to look deeper, because she was not deflecting, she was telling the truth in a way he had never considered before. She turned slightly, picking up a menu that had been left askew on a nearby table, straightening it with the same care she applied to everything else. "I just listened," she added, her voice calm, matter of fact, and Daniel felt something shift inside him again, because listening was not something he associated with power, not in the way he had lived his life, but standing there, in a room that had nearly fallen apart, and then been quietly put back together, he began to understand that maybe he had been wrong, not about everything, but about something important, something fundamental. And as Emily moved away, returning to her work as if the moment had already passed for her, Daniel remained still, watching, not because he did not know what to do next, but because for the first time in a long time, he was not sure he understood the rules anymore. The restaurant slowly reclaimed its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm as before. It was softer now, more aware, as if every person in the room had been reminded of something they could not quite name. Conversations resumed in low voices, careful, almost respectful, like people stepping back into a space that had proven it could change without warning. Daniel returned to his table, but did not sit immediately, his eyes still following Emily as she moved between tables, refilling a glass here, adjusting a plate there, the same quiet efficiency, the same unshaken presence. And yet now every movement carried a weight he had not seen before, not because she had changed, but because he had. He lowered himself into the chair slowly, the contract in front of him untouched, the pen resting exactly where he had left it. And for the first time in years, numbers felt distant, almost irrelevant, his attention drawn instead to something he could not measure, something he could not control. Emily passed by his table without stopping, offering a brief, professional nod, the kind she would give any customer. And that, more than anything, unsettled him, because there was no acknowledgement of what had happened, no shift in how she saw him. He was not important in her world, not in the way he was used to being important, and that realization sat with him in a way no financial loss ever had. "Your steak, sir," another server said, placing a plate in front of him, the aroma rising, perfectly prepared, exactly as expected. And yet Daniel did not reach for his fork. He simply stared at it for a moment, then leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting again, searching, not for answers, but for understanding. Across the room, Emily paused near the entrance, her eyes moving briefly to the door, then to the windows, then back to the room. The same pattern, the same quiet awareness, and Daniel recognized it now, not as habit, but as something learned, something earned. He stood again, unable to ignore the pull any longer, and crossed the room with measured steps, stopping a respectful distance from her, not imposing, not demanding, just present. "You said you just listened," he began, his voice lower now, less certain, less controlled. "But most people do not hear what you heard." Emily looked at him, her expression calm, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, not reluctance, not pride, just a quiet understanding of the question behind his words. She glanced briefly toward the door, then back at him. "Most people are trying to respond," she said, her tone even, "so they miss what is actually there." Daniel absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the truth of it, and it unsettled him again, because he realized how often he had done exactly that, listening only long enough to speak, to decide, to control the outcome, never long enough to truly understand the moment itself. Emily picked up a folded napkin from a nearby table, smoothing it absent-mindedly as she continued. "If you slow down, if you pay attention, people tell you everything." She met his gaze again, steady, unwavering. "You just have to be willing to hear it." Daniel let out a slow breath, not realizing until that moment how much he had been holding in, the tension of a life built on speed, on decisions made quickly, on outcomes forced into place. And here, in this quiet conversation with someone who held no title, no authority, he felt something shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to matter, enough to stay with him. Emily gave a small nod, as if the conversation had reached its natural end, and turned to continue her work, leaving Daniel standing there, not dismissed, not ignored, but gently returned to himself. And as he watched her walk away, blending once again into the quiet rhythm of the room, he understood something he had never considered before, that sometimes the most powerful presence in a room is the one that does not need to be seen at all. The night did not end with applause or dramatic declarations. It ended the way most important moments do, quietly, almost unnoticed by the world outside. The restaurant lights dimmed slightly as the hour grew later, conversations returned to normal tones, and one by one, people resumed their lives, but not quite the same as before. Daniel sat back at his table, the untouched meal now cold, the contract still unsigned. And for the first time in years, he did not feel the urgency to move forward, to close the deal, to secure the outcome. Instead, he sat in the stillness, letting the moment settle, letting it change him in ways he did not yet fully understand. Across the room, Emily continued her shift, clearing tables, refilling glasses, offering quiet smiles when needed, her presence unchanged, steady, grounded, as if the earlier tension had passed through her without leaving a mark, and perhaps it had, not because she was unaffected, but because she had learned long ago how to carry moments like that without letting them define her. Daniel finally reached for his jacket, standing slowly, his movements no longer driven by habit, but by thought, deliberate, aware. He walked toward the exit, then paused, turning back one last time, his eyes finding Emily again, not because she demanded attention, but because she never did, and somehow that made her impossible to ignore. She was speaking softly to an elderly couple now, her posture slightly lowered, her voice gentle, matching their pace, their world, just as she had matched his earlier, just as she had matched the man who had walked in carrying more than anyone could see. And Daniel understood it then, not completely, but enough. She did not change who she was depending on the situation. She stayed the same. And in doing so, she allowed others to find their way back to themselves. He stepped outside into the cool night air, the city alive in its usual rhythm, cars passing, distant conversations, blending into a steady hum. But something inside him had shifted, something quiet but permanent. He looked down at his hands for a moment. The same hands that had signed deals worth millions, that had shaped companies, that had controlled outcomes. And yet tonight, they had done nothing. And still, everything had changed. He exhaled slowly, a faint smile forming, not of satisfaction, but of recognition. Because he realized that for all his success, for all his control, there was a kind of strength he had never learned, a kind that did not rely on power, did not require authority, a kind that simply existed in presence, in awareness, in the ability to see others clearly without needing to change them. And as he walked away, blending into the flow of the city, he carried that understanding with him, not as a lesson he could write down or quantify, but as something quieter, something deeper, the kind of truth that does not need to be spoken to be felt, because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is not the one who leads or commands or decides, but the one who listens, and in that listening, changes everything without ever raising their voice.